The Jews are the most worthless of all men. They are lecherous, greedy, rapacious. They are perfidious murderers of Christ. They worship the devil. Their religion is a sickness. The Jews are the odious assassins of Christ, and for killing God there is no expiation possible, no indulgence or pardon. Christians may never cease vengeance, and the Jew must live in servitude forever. God always hated the Jews. It is essential that all Christians hate them. These were the words of Ambrose, an early church father from the 4th century AD and Bishop of Milan, whose pastoral guidance and theological insights played a pivotal role in the conversion of Augustine of Hippo, one of the most influential figures in Christian history. Ambrose was no minor figure in the church world at the time. His leadership and influence greatly impacted Christianity in Europe. His eloquent preaching, pastoral care, and theological writings attracted many to the Christian faith, including influential figures, like I said before, such as Augustine of Hippo. Ambrose's defense of biblical truths against false teachings, particularly his staunch opposition to Arianism, helped to solidify the church's doctrinal unity in the West. Yet, as impactful as he was to early Christianity, by his own words, Ambrose was a Jew hater. Anti-Semitism, the prejudice and discrimination against Jewish people, is no recent phenomenon. It has deep historical roots and manifested in various forms throughout history. One of those forms is Christian Antisemitism, the manifestation of Jewish hate in the Christian world, namely in Europe. Understanding the history of Christian anti-Semitism is crucial for understanding current European anti-Semitism and attitudes towards Jews in the Western world. Simply put, anti-Semitism encompasses a range of attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors directed against individuals or communities of Jewish descent. It can manifest in overt forms such as violence, persecution, and hate speech, as well as in subtler expressions including stereotypes, prejudice, and social exclusion. At its core, anti-Semitism is rooted in prejudice and misinformation, perpetuating harmful myths and stereotypes about Jewish people and their culture. Understanding the history of Christian anti-Semitism is essential for several reasons. First and foremost, it sheds light on the origins and evolution of this phenomenon within the context of Western civilization. It is an uncomfortable truth that the Church has played a significant role in perpetuating prejudice and discrimination against Jewish people throughout history. By examining the historical interactions between Christians and Jews, we can gain insight into the factors that have contributed to the persistence of anti-Semitism within Christian societies. While Christianity teaches the values of love, mercy, compassion, and tolerance, the reality is that followers of the faith have often fallen short of these ideals when it comes to their treatment of Jewish communities. Welcome to Prophecy Matters UK. My name is Jay Nemhard, and in this video essay, we'll delve into the early roots of Christian anti-Semitism, starting with Jewish migration into Europe, the early church fathers, Jewish relationships with Europeans during the Roman Empire, and the treatment of Jews up until medieval Europe. Please like and subscribe and hit that notification bell for further updates. When Antiochus Epiphanes, seen by some as a precursor to the Antichrist, sought to suppress Jewish religious practices in the middle of the 2nd century BC, the Maccabees, a Jewish rebel group led by Judah Maccabee, resisted his efforts and sought assistance from Rome. Sending emissaries to forge an alliance, they appealed to Rome for support. The Romans, keen on extending their influence in the eastern Mediterranean, welcomed the proposal and joined the fight against the Seleucid Greeks. However, little did the Jews know that their alliance with Rome would ultimately lead to significant changes in their fortunes. The relationship between the Jews and Rome would undergo a significant transformation as the Jews came to realize that what began as a short-term solution with the Romans had evolved into a long-term problem. The Roman Empire, initially an ally against the Seleucids, later asserted dominance in the region. In 63 BC, Roman forces captured Jerusalem, leading to the captivity of thousands of Jews in Rome. This event set the stage for the eventual destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD, and a widespread dispersal of the Jewish population known as the diaspora. This unforeseen turn of events would shape Jewish history and identity for centuries to come. But I digress. After the Romans agreed to the alliance, some Jewish leaders and their families relocated to Rome to cultivate relationships with the Romans. Additionally, the forced displacement of thousands of Jews, as mentioned earlier, along with voluntary migration from Alexandria, Egypt, as Rome and Alexandria had close trade ties, these all contributed to the formation of the Jewish community in Rome. This community, the oldest in Europe, has existed in Rome for over 2,100 years. During this period, Jews experienced relative peace and prosperity. Julius Caesar granted them the right to own property, maintain their internal affairs autonomously, and exempt them from military service based on their religious beliefs. The Jewish community in Rome held him in high regard, evident from historical records documenting their mourning for him with great sorrow at his passing. His successor Augustus maintained favorable treatment of Jews. In addition to upholding their existing rights, he authorized collecting an annual tax from Roman Jews for the temple in Jerusalem. If that wasn't enough, Augustus and his wife, Empress Livia, arranged to send regular donations of a bull and 2 lambs for burnt offerings at the temple. These donations may have been driven by pragmatism to foster positive relations with Jews in Rome and Judea. Still, they nonetheless demonstrate his careful and deliberate approach towards them. The early Roman emperors tolerated different religious traditions, allowing peoples and cultures to practice their faiths, even incorporating some religious beliefs of conquered peoples, as long as they didn't threaten the Roman authority and stability. Jews, for the most part, were exempt from emperor worship. However, the mad Caesar, Caligula, once ordered his statue to be placed in a Jewish temple in Jerusalem. This edict never came to pass, as Caligula was assassinated before it could be put into effect. Maybe this unsettling period for Jews in Rome acted as a forewarning of impending challenges, as in following years, although not directly endangering the Jewish way of life in Rome, various issues began to emerge. Claudius, the uncle and successor of Caligula, expelled some Jews from Rome in 49 AD. According to the Roman historian Suetonius, Claudius banished from Rome all the Jews who were continually making disturbances at the instigation of one Chrestus. Chrestus is more likely a reference to Jesus, and we see confirmation of this in Acts 18 verses 1-2, where we read, "After these things, Paul departed from Athens and went to Corinth. And he found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome, and he came to them." The record is unclear, but one can assume that tensions arose between Christian and non-Christian Jews as Christianity spread from Judea into other parts of the Roman Empire, including Rome. The tensions were enough to alert the Roman authorities, who viewed this as a threat to the peace and stability of the city, and called for the expulsion of Jews who were neither enslaved nor citizens. No Roman citizen could be expelled without due process of a trial, and historical records do not indicate any such legal proceedings. Moreover, masters would not likely tolerate their slaves being expelled from Rome without compensation or consent. Less than 2 decades later, large numbers of Jews from Judea were captured and enslaved by the Romans during the First Roman-Jewish War, and were subsequently brought to Rome to labor on the construction of the Colosseum. The funding for the Colosseum's construction was acquired through the spoils of war, including the riches plundered from the Jewish temple following its destruction. Jews living in Rome were able to redeem their fellow Jews, and along with those who survived the labor camps, caused the Jewish community to grow extensively. Interestingly, a significant war between Rome and Jewish rebels in Judea did not affect Roman-Jewish relations in Rome. However, the 2 Roman-Jewish wars were responsible for the Jewish diaspora throughout Asia, Africa, and Europe, and such a story is too much to discuss for such a short video. Initially, Christianity emerged within a Jewish context, and many of its earliest followers were Jewish. Jesus himself was a Jew, as were his disciples and the early leaders of the Christian movement. Early Christians continued participating in Jewish religious practices and worshiping in synagogues alongside their fellow Jews. However, tensions between early Christians and Jewish authorities escalated, mainly as Christianity spread beyond Jewish communities and gained Gentile converts. Conflicts arose over the interpretation of Jewish law, the role of Jesus as the Messiah, the inclusion of Gentiles in a Christian community without requiring adherence to Jewish customs such as circumcision, as seen in Acts 15. Jewish leaders, aware of the growing influence of Christianity, began to ostracize and persecute Jewish followers of Jesus, often expelling them from synagogues and labeling them as heretics. One good example can be found in Acts 13:45-50. But when the Jews saw the crowds, they were filled with jealousy and began to contradict what was spoken by Paul, reviling him. And Paul and Barnabas spoke boldly, saying, "It was necessary that the word of God be spoken first to you, since you thrust it aside and judge yourself unworthy of eternal life. Behold, we are turning to the Gentiles, for so the Lord has commanded us, saying, I have made you a light for the Gentiles, that you may bring salvation to the ends of the earth." And when the Gentiles heard this, they began rejoicing and glorifying the word of the Lord, as many as were appointed to eternal life believed. And the word of the Lord was spreading throughout the whole region. But the Jews incited the devout women of high standing, and the leading men of the city stirred up persecution against Paul and Barnabas, and drove them out of their district. Spread of Christianity beyond Jewish communities led to a distinct identity formation among Christians, separate from Judaism. However, Jewish opposition persisted, as evident in Revelation chapter 2 verse 9, written around 90 AD, where Jesus addressed the faithful church of Smyrna, saying, "I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich, and the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are of the synagogue of Satan." Since Satan means the opposer, the Jews of Smyrna were labeled as a synagogue of Satan, as they resisted the gospel, made life more challenging for Christians, and over time the church adopted this language, wielding it against Jews as it gained power, leading to its misuse in condemning Jewish communities. Jewish antipathy towards Jesus continued for centuries after his death and resurrection. The Sanhedrin 43a, and this is a page of the Sanhedrin tractate of the Babylonian Talmud, says Jesus was hanged on Passover Eve. 40 days previously the heralded cried, "He's being led out for stoning because he has practiced sorcery and has led Israel astray and enticed them into apostasy. Whoever has anything to say in his defense, let him come and declare it." As nothing was brought forward in his defense, he was hanged on Passover Eve. The Shabbat 104b of the Babylonian Talmud also states, incidentally, the Gemara asks, why did they call him, that's Jesus, Ben Stada, when he was a son of Pandera? Pandera is a Roman soldier. Rav Hizda said, his mother's husband who acted as his father was named Stada, but the one who had relations with his mother and fathered him was named Pandera. The Gemara asked, wasn't his mother's husband Pappos ben Yehuda? Rather, his mother was named Stada and he was named Ben Stada after her. The Gemara asks, but wasn't his mother Miriam, who braided women's hair? The Gemara explains, that is not a contradiction. Rather, Stada was merely a nickname, as they say in the Pumbedita. Pumbedita is an ancient Jewish center of learning and scholarship in present-day Iraq. This one strayed, Setadda, from her husband, play on words therefore. Thus, the idea is truly blasphemous regarding Jesus' mother and her relationship with Joseph, with the nickname Stada being a play on words meaning adultery. I cannot get myself to write out the explicit meaning of those words, but you get the idea. There are more blasphemous and hateful comments about Jesus in the Babylonian Talmud. Still, I think just 2 examples are enough to get the point. I mentioned them to highlight that it wasn't just one-way traffic when it came to highlighting religious conflicts between different communities. The Jews also said many things that were blasphemous to Christians, and while it's crucial to acknowledge that anti-Semitic sentiments have been wrongly perpetuated throughout history, it is also important to recognize that such sentiments were not one-sided. Instances like those in the Babylonian Talmud demonstrate that animosity and derogatory remarks were not confined to one group or religion. But let me add, it doesn't mean that the early church was privy to such documents as the Talmud, although the sentiments would have been expressed in some way, shape, or form. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that tensions between both groups existed since the inception of Christianity. While we see early Jewish hostility towards Christianity, as Christianity continued to grow among the non-Jewish world, the tide shifted and the hostility became primarily from Christians, morphing into Christian antisemitism. This is not something talked about much in recent times. Judging from books recording the writings of the early church fathers, it would appear as if Christian antisemitism never existed and all they spoke about were spiritual and virtuous. But it isn't as if they were hypocritical, that is, writing in defense of the Christian faith in public or privately belittling the Jews. In those days, everything was out in the open, and some were unashamedly anti-Jewish in their rhetoric. I used words from an early church father, Ambrose of Milan, in my introduction. Now I want to use the words of other church fathers, starting with John Chrysostom, who served as the Archbishop of Constantinople, which is now modern-day Istanbul, between 397 and 404 AD. This is one of the prominent leadership positions in the early church, and today, the Archbishop of Constantinople is also known as the Patriarch of Constantinople, the first among equals and the leader of the Eastern Orthodox Church. He was given a last name Chrysostom because of his excellent public speaking ability, which means golden mouth. He was known as a very devout, humble and compassionate man. He was influential in the creation of many hospitals in Constantinople, and yet, for all of his good deeds and helpful sermons, he had an anti-Semitic streak. In one sermon he said, "Indeed, the synagogue deserves less honor than any inn. It is not merely a lodging place for robbers and cheats, but also for demons. This is true not only of the synagogues, but also the souls of the Jews." But it gets worse. In his sixth homily against the Jews, Chrysostom said, "How dare Christians have the slightest doings with Jews, those most miserable of all men? They are lustful, rapacious, greedy, perfidious bandits, pests of the universe. Indeed, an entire day would not suffice to tell of all their rapine, their avarice, their deception of the poor, their thievery, and their huckstering. Are they not inveterate murderers, destroyers, men possessed by the devil? Jews are impure and impious, and their synagogue is a house of prostitution, a lair of beasts, a place of shame and ridicule, the domicile of the devil, as is also the soul of the Jew. As a matter of fact, Jews worship the devil. Their rites are criminal and unchaste, their religion a disease, their synagogue an assembly of crooks, a den of thieves, a cavern of devils, an abyss of perdition. Why are the Jews degenerate? Because of their hateful assassination of Christ. This supreme crime lies at the root of their degradation and woes. The rejection and the dispersion of the Jews was a work of God, and because of his absolute abandonment of the Jews. Thus, the Jew will live under the yoke of slavery without end. God hates the Jews, and on Judgment Day he will say to those who sympathize with them, "Depart from me, for you have had doings with my murderers." Flee then from their assemblies, fly from their houses, and far from venerating the synagogue, hold it in hatred and aversion. In the early days of the church in Roman Europe, there were back and forth tensions between Jews and Christians. However, as Christianity began to firmly establish itself in the Roman Empire, influencing the political and economic power structures, the marginalization of Jews increased, portraying them as outsiders and enemies of Christianity. The process was gradual, but by the late Roman Empire and early into the medieval period, Jews were increasingly subjected to discriminatory laws, social ostracism, and occasional outbreaks of violence. One early example of this was the Theodosian Code, a compilation of all Roman law from Emperor Constantine to Emperor Theodosius III, a task completed in 438 AD. This code represented a pivotal moment in the legal treatment of Jews within the empire as Christianity gained ascendancy, introducing a series of restrictive measures aimed explicitly at Jewish communities. It forbade Jews from interfering with conversions to Christianity. It prohibited them from owning enslaved Christians, effectively limiting their economic and social mobility. Additionally, the code prohibited Jews from proselyting among Christians and from building new synagogues, reflecting an increased hostility towards Judaism within Christian society. Throughout these decrees, Judaism was disparaged as nefarious and sacrilegious, underscoring the negative attitudes prevalent towards Jews in Roman Christian circles. These legal restrictions not only marginalized Jewish communities, but but also contributed to their economic and social isolation, further solidifying the subordinate status of Jews within Christianized societies. In the first 6 centuries, the church was not pro-Jewish to say the least. However, this isn't to say that all early church leaders were openly hostile. When it came to his relationship with the Jews, Gregory the Great, the Bishop of Rome, 590 to 604 AD, was a complex character. While enthusiastic towards Jewish conversion to Christianity, he wasn't a fan of coercion, believing that anyone, quote, brought to the font of baptism, not by the sweetness of preaching, but by compulsion, he returns to his former superstition and dies the worse of having been born again, end quote. Once, when he discovered that the bishop of the church in Palermo, Sicily, had confiscated a Jewish synagogue and promptly consecrated it as a church against his wishes, thus making it impossible to be returned to the Jews as a synagogue, he financially reimbursed them for the loss of their building and ordered a search for their stolen items. Author Jacob Marcus, in his book The Jew in Medieval World, believes that Gregory's mindset was a, quote, a desire to adhere closely to the principles of Roman law, which already defined the privileges and disabilities of the Jews. He himself did nothing, however, to improve their legal condition. Marcus may be correct, but was there more than that possible? If Gregory was anti-Jewish, why go through all the trouble to compensate them for their loss? Why was he bothered to resolve an issue he could have ignored? Was there an element of compassion or at least a sense of justice? During the reigns of Charlemagne, who died 814 AD, and his son Louis the Pious, who died 840 AD, both of the Carolingian Empire, Jews fared reasonably well under their rule. Charlemagne encouraged Jewish migration to the Rhineland there in Germany from Italy and southern France, causing trade and the economy to flourish. Not only were they allowed to trade freely, but they could also practice their faith without fear, own property, build synagogues, hold public office, and even own Christian slaves, something the Catholic Church frowned upon. Charlemagne was highly pragmatic and understood that Jews had established trade networks and trading centers throughout the Middle East and as far as India and China. These Jewish networks were allowed to thrive as Jews were free to move throughout Islamic regions, whereas Christians were not. As Jewish society expanded and thrived in what is now France and Germany during the medieval period, it gave rise to a distinct cultural identity known as Ashkenazi, primarily associated with the regions of modern-day Germany and parts of Central and Eastern Europe, a community that survives to this day. In closing, Jewish communities in Christian Europe were seldom welcomed with open arms, encountering either overt hostile forces or at best ambivalent attitudes. Jews faced significant challenges ranging from outright persecution and violence to a more subtle form of discrimination and marginalization. Despite these challenges, Jews persevered in Europe, managing to navigate a complex and often hostile social landscape. Things would change for the worse in the 13th century. On the next episode, we will continue our look at Christian anti-Semitism and how it manifested itself in both the Catholic and the Protestant churches. And so if you like what you heard, please subscribe and share and hit that notification bell. If you didn't like what you heard, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.